right, bear with me just a second. This is new. This is a new show. Welcome to Tales from the Dragon's Library. I talked about this a little bit in the last couple of streams that I wanted to do, and let me explain this just a little bit here. Okay, good. The video is showing. I may find a way to make this a little bit more user friendly. But right now, here's what I want to do. I got this idea from a writer, so this is not my original idea, but I got this idea from a writer whose class I took at Gen Con last year, and he said he got a lot of positive feedback from people, and a lot of people really enjoyed it, and he had a lot of fun doing it. So my novel, The Last Exodus, is done, but it needs a pretty good bit of editing, which you're going to find out over the coming weeks and months, hopefully. And I may have to self-publish it, which means I'm going to have to do all the editing myself. And I thought it might be an interesting idea, or an interesting interaction. Yeah, of course, my glasses are going to glare. Oh well, I can read without them, thankfully. It might be an interesting way to interact with you guys if I sort of read my book, look for your feedback or your ideas, and make edits as I go along. I don't know. You guys might not like it. I don't know if we're going to get any viewers. Who knows? We'll see. We'll see how it goes. So that's sort of what this is going to be. It's going to be an interactive audiobook. You can just turn me on and listen. Yeah, turn me on. You can just listen. You obviously don't have to watch the video. It's just going to be me and the text going by. You may get to see how some of the edits are done, some things that pop up, and how the book is formatted. If you have questions about writing, I have a couple things published. I have published some smaller works. I've not published a novel yet, but if you do have any questions, drop those in the chat. If you have any ideas, I can't say that I'm going to take your suggestions and work them into the book, but if anything stands out as glaringly obvious, really unusual, doesn't make sense, let me know. And we'll see what we could do to make it make more sense for you. So that's the premise of the show. Now, the book, The Last Exodus, just so you guys have an idea of what you're in for. This is set in the not too distant future in America. It is sort of a dystopian future book. The idea behind The Last Exodus is, for quite a few years, I was watching a lot and reading a lot of political commentary and opinion pieces and opinion shows, and some of the stuff that I was seeing that people were proposing over the decades, the last few decades in the United States, things that people were proposing were really, really crazy. And thankfully, those people never had enough power to actually enact some of that stuff. For example, one of the ones that has always stood out to me is there is audio, and I may link this if I can find it, but there is audio of I believe it was the FBI investigation of the Weather Underground in the 70s, I believe, or late 60s, early 70s. And they have recording of one of the members of the Weather Underground saying that in order to get real change in America, to really get things the way it should be, you would have to incarcerate. I'm going to get the numbers wrong, but it was a large amount. Their estimate, I think, you would have to incarcerate 25% of the population at least in re-education camps, and that you would have to eliminate or kill another quarter of the population in order to get things where to get this change that they wanted, these things in place. So that kind of struck me as really crazy. And what if, guys, basically the idea was, what if enough of those people were in power and could get the changes put through, all of the changes put through that they wanted, with little to no resistance? What would America look like? What would it look like for the people living here? And how would some people react? Obviously, we are a very independently minded people for the most part. Obviously, different regions and different states and different cultures and different parts of our society are different. You can't generalize everybody under one umbrella, but overall, Americans are known for being extremely independent, extremely resistant to change. We like to keep things comfortable, and change needs to come with a real reason, a real purpose, or we don't take to it too well. So I wanted to write a story. What would it look like if these changes were enacted, and how would people react? What would people do? And that is The Last Exodus. It is a political story, so I know a lot of people don't want politics in their existing entertainment. Some people are not into political stuff. I will say that this is a political story. I will also say that being a political story, this very much looks at it from every angle. It is not my intent or desire to single out any one political ideology or group for the problems that exist in this particular story. I got a stupid hangnail I can't stop messing with. So if you are not into political stories, you may or may not be into this. That's up to you. So we're going to get started. Essentially, I'm going to read and edit. Hopefully you like it. If you don't, let me know. If you like it, let me know. If you're watching, drop something in the chat to let me know. And damn it, the YouTube video is frozen. Hold on. Let me refresh over on the YouTubes. So I refreshed it and it's back. Alright, I think we're okay. Hopefully we didn't miss much over on the YouTube. Alright, and I'm going to look. Mixer seems to have a DVR type functionality to save videos. We may be leaving YouTube altogether before too long. So anyway, here we go. We're going to get started. This is Tales from the Dragon's Library. I'm going to be reading The Last Exodus and editing as I go. Please shout out in the chat if you see anything, think of anything, have any questions or ideas, and we're going to get started. This is The Last Exodus, Chapter 1. If you cannot read the text on the screen, I apologize. I am going to read it. So let's get started. This is all new, so let's try it out. This part is, if you can't see it, all in italics. I imagine if you asked people before everything changed if they thought America would look like it does now. That's going to be a weird sentence. We're going to change that. So let's start it. I imagine if you asked people before everything changed if they thought America would look like it does now, they would say, not in a million years. That sentence is really jacked up. I imagine if you... So this is from our main character's perspective, and he's asking sort of a rhetorical question. I imagine if you asked people if they thought America would look... I imagine if you asked people before everything changed what they thought America would look like. In a couple of decades, this wouldn't be it. That makes more sense. So I imagine if you asked people before everything changed in a couple of decades... No, I've fracked it up even more. I imagine if you asked people before everything changed, what would America look like in a couple of decades? This wouldn't be it. It didn't take nearly that long. Some people believe the beginning of the end of America was in the early part of the century. America elected an extremely progressive president. No one remembers, or no one cares, whether he was a Republican or Democrat. It doesn't really matter anyway. Others said it started long before the Great Wars or during the Great Depression. As many theories as there are people to think them up. I didn't say that right, so it doesn't really matter anyway. Others said it started long before the Great Wars or during the Great Depression. As many theories as there are people to think them up. All I can say now is that it doesn't matter anymore. What's done is done, and all we can do is live with our mistakes. Excerpt from the Journal of John Everman. So John Everman is writing these journal pieces. I gotta fix that there. Alright, so now we're going to jump into the narrative. And you guys, like I said, shout out if anything stands out as strange or doesn't make sense. I will edit as I go, and I will reread whatever I edit. John took his jacket from the locker marked with his number, pulling it over his sore shoulders. He grabbed a steel lunchbox from the bottom of the locker and turned to leave the break room. The floor manager stood in his office doorway, catching John's attention as he walked by. "Your line is down 12% with Hernandez out again." "I'll come in early tomorrow and catch up," John said, his normally soft voice rough from hours on the dry factory floor. Several of the workers in the room gave John a disgruntled look. "It will be outside your contract time, John," the floor manager said. "We can't give you extra time off later." "I know, Terrence," John patted the dark-skinned man on the shoulder as he passed. The drab walls of the break room and hall were broken every so often by a colorful poster espousing the merits of hard work and doing one's part for the community. In stark contrast, most of John's co-workers stood, exhausted, waiting in line down the hall for their turn at the time clock. Work was something that many did, not something they wanted to or cared about. John could remember a time, when he was younger, when his father and grandfather used words like work ethic and pride. And pride had meaning. That needs to be... That needs to be rephrased. When his father and grandfather used words like work ethic. I guess that works. And pride had meaning. Now it was all about getting through the day with nothing to look forward to except the same tedious tomorrow. He picked up a broken chair that had been leaning against his locker before leaving the break room. One of the last men in line stepped out and followed John toward the front door, stopping him where no one could overhear. "What are you doing, John?" he asked in a hoarse whisper. "You know our contract with the feds means no extra rations for extra work?" "Work has to get done, Carl. It's not about the pay." Carl scratched at the short stubble atop his head and looked back at the line of workers. He waited while one of their co-workers passed on the way out the doors, and then he turned his eyes to John again. "It makes everyone look bad. If we still had unions, they wouldn't stand for it," Carl said. John shrugged and looked back down the line of people, standing complacent as cattle outside a slaughterhouse. "No one should feel bad. We're all the same, right? We're all the same now, right?" There was a hint of sarcasm in his voice, and they both knew without looking at the wall that John was standing in front of a poster depicting three androgynous, faceless people in gray coveralls standing on the edge of a cliff or building. Each held a different tool, but they were otherwise identical. Against the red background, printed in gold letters, were the words free, fair, and equal. I need to fix that. Those should all be capitalized. Free, fair, and equal. It's the title or something. "Just be careful, John," Carl said before returning to the line. "Don't draw more attention than normal." John exited the mill and looked up at the lettering over the main doors. Looked at the lettering over the main doors of the National Department of Agriculture, Stewart Mill. The sky over the sign was leaden, and the air was colder than the day before. He sighed and started the long walk home, hoping the coming winter would be milder than the last. John's family did not own a car, not that anyone else owned a car either. The government denied John's application for a car because it was determined he lived close enough to his workplace to ride public transportation. When he appealed, stating that Stewart, Illinois, was too small of a town to have public transportation, his application was denied, citing a new ruling that 5 miles was close enough to walk. John scratched an itch on his shoulder blade as he passed Stewart's hardware store. His fingers passed over the white stenciled letters on the back of his grayish-blue jacket. His numbers were always there as a reminder that he was just a number in the system. I need to fix that. His digits were always there as a reminder that he was just a number in the system. Not John, but a series of numerals to pass through the database and bureaucracy faster. So I'm going to reread that sentence because I botched it all up. His digits were always there as a reminder that he was just a number in the system. Not John, but a series of numerals to pass through the data banks and bureaucracy faster. He waved at Mike Connors, the old man who used to own the hardware store. Mike was sweeping the steps under a sign reading National Hardware Supply Stewart Unit. Mike stopped sweeping and nodded in greeting, watching John pass by. John saw people he had known since childhood, walking around town with no apparent purpose. When work was done for the day, many people had no idea what to do with themselves. Most forms of entertainment had been eliminated or changed to meet new regulations. People used to go out and meet friends and date, but few saw the point anymore. People still had to get out of the house. Meeting in groups was against the law, as was loitering on government property, so most just wandered around town until they got bored and went home. Just a few storefronts down from the hardware supply was a furniture repair shop where Stewart's only contracted furniture carpenter worked. John put his hands on the glass door that still bore the faded letters naming it Jerome's Woodworks, under a newer sign stating Furniture Repair, Stewart. He pushed the door open and walked through a shop that was piled high with rows of broken chairs, tables, cabinets, and other pieces of furniture. No one else in town was authorized to do their own repairs. It wouldn't be fair to take the work away from another citizen. "Jerome, I have a chair here that needs fixed," John called out. He didn't hear any power tools running in the back to drown him out. "That you, John?" Jerome's mellow voice called out from the back. The man entered the room, wiping wood shavings off his jeans with a large rag. Jerome was a giant of a man, at least a head taller than John. Ebony skin rippled with muscles across his bare arms, and sawdust clung to the sweat of the workday. His white face broke into a smile when he saw John. Jerome took the chair from John like he was handling a wounded animal. What happened to this guy? Thomas was leaning back in it again, and it tipped, John explained. Leaning back in it again, and it tipped. "Your boy all right?" Bumped his head, but nothing serious. "Well, I'll get the chair in line." Jerome gestured to the furniture that surrounded them. "Not sure when it will be done." "No luck getting some help around here?" John asked. "Stewart's too small to support a second carpenter," Jerome said in a tone like he was quoting a letter from the National Labor Board. John just shook his head and offered his hand to the big carpenter. Jerome took it in his strong grip. "Say hi to Amanda for me," Jerome said. John nodded and headed out of the store, giving another quick wave as the door closed behind him. John turned the corner and started up the Harper Street hill. He passed by a random brick building with a faded placard. He passed a run-down brick building with a faded placard above the door that read Jerry's Pub. He remembered the day Jerry had closed his beloved bar. Nearly the whole town showed up to say goodbye to the old place that had been a Stewart institution since the end of the first Prohibition. Now the building sat like a forgotten friend, empty windows staring out onto the town that had long since given up hope of ever entering those welcoming doors again. Beyond the abandoned pub stood a long line of houses that ran up the street in front of John. They were classic American, small-town types of houses. Types, plural. Oh, I've spelled it. They were American, small-town type houses, some of which had been around since the turn of the last century. Most had small fenced-in yards with little concrete porches. A few toys lay in the grass among fallen leaves, recently dropped from the surrounding trees, but not many. He remembered when the sound of dogs barking could be heard in the neighborhood, but as far as he knew, there weren't any pets anymore. Owning pets had been ruled inhumane, and most of the animals had been put down. The useful ones were turned into work animals for the government. But the rest couldn't just be released. Some owners could not turn their pets over and release them out into the country. The farmers were still dealing with the packs of feral dogs that attacked national livestock. John smiled when he saw some kids playing tag near the top of the hill. Children were the exception to the law that prevented adults from gathering in large groups. Believed to be no threat, they were permitted to gather and play between the end of school and curfew. They all had little grayish-blue jackets over their school uniforms. He almost didn't notice the numbers anymore. The children ran about, squealing and laughing while he watched. Their game was silhouetted against the gray October sky, and for a time John forgot everything except what it had been like to be a child and have no care except to enjoy the moment. When one of the kids looked in his direction, he waved, and two of them came running over, shouting advice to their friends. After a quick hug, the trio continued to walk up Harper Street. More kids than usual, John commented. The bus broke down again. Everyone had to walk, the boy said. The district had one bus, so kids at the end of the route wouldn't be home before dinner. Well, walking never hurts you two, John said. At least they'll get home in time to have dinner with their folks. John and his wife wanted their kids home for dinner every night, so rather than ride the bus and be one of the last ones off, they walked to the top of Harper Street and met their dad on the way home. The little girl took John's hand, and he smiled down at her. How was school, Susan? He asked. Susan kicked a small stone, sending it skittering and bouncing down the road. Fine, Daddy. Just fine? John asked. Susan nodded her head, causing her brown curls to bounce a bit. She squeezed his hand and giggled, and then ran off after the stone to give it another kick. John watched her and chuckled at her antics. She was tall for 8 and smart. He was a sucker for those big blue eyes, and Susan knew it, too. John would move heaven and earth for those eyes. The boy was walking quietly next to him, hands in his pockets and his face turned down in thought. John patted his shoulder. Thomas? Huh? Thomas looked up and snapped out of his thoughts. What's on your mind, son? I was thinking about class today. Do other kids have to learn history when they get home? John watched Susan skip down the road for a moment before answering. I don't know, Thomas. It's important for you, though, to learn the truth, because things won't always be this way. John waved his hand, indicating the world around them. When things get put back the way they should be, the world will need people who know how it got this way in the first place. We were reading about that Chinese guy, Mao, who lived a long time ago. The book at school said that he was a great leader and helped the world, but didn't you tell us he killed lots of people? John nodded grimly, taking a moment to stifle the rising anger that he felt, not toward his son, but toward the school. Yes, Thomas, he killed lots of people to get what he wanted. That's why we study this at home, so we remember. Just makes me sad, Thomas said quietly. Me too, son. John put his hand on the boy's shoulder. The trio rounded a corner, turning onto their street, and saw federal agents parked outside a home a few doors down from their own. 2 black cars were in front of the small house, and 2 officers were standing by them, watching the street. John and his kids could hear shouting coming through the open front door of the small white house. A crash sounded from somewhere inside, and a moment later 2 more officers exited, pushing a small Asian man out in front of them. His hands appeared to be cuffed behind. Behind his back. Pardon me. Mr. Lee, you are charged with overdrawing rations and hoarding food, one of the officers said loudly. John had stopped walking at the sound of the crash, and all 3 were close enough to the house to hear everything. Seeing his neighbor's face pulled at his heart, especially since John had considered finding a way to draw more rations himself. With the shortage, everyone seemed to have just enough to get by. He hadn't realized it, but his fists were balled tightly, and he took a step toward the officers. I'm sorry, Mr. Lee was saying. We need the food. Our son is sick. Everyone needs the food, Mr. Lee, the arresting officer said in the professional monotone that all federal officers seemed to use. Mr. Lee looked up and saw John and the kids looking on. The defeated look in the man's eyes brought John forward another step. He didn't know what he would or could do, but he felt like something had to be done. Move along, children. This is none of your business. The voice of one of the other officers snapped John out of his thoughts. I'm sorry, that's not children. Move along, citizen. This is none of your business. The voice of one of the other officers snapped John out of his thoughts. For a moment, the approaching officer became the target of John's simmering rage. He could feel every muscle in his body tense as if preparing to lash out, but it all came crashing down with a tug on his pants and his daughter's voice. Daddy, I'm scared. Susan was pulling at his pocket to get his attention. Those blue eyes that always touched his heart were on the verge of tears. Can we go home? Her voice shook a little. John tamped down his anger and picked her up, all thoughts of doing something that would put him in jail forgotten. Let's go see what Mommy has for dinner. And that's the end of chapter 1. So cool. This chapter actually I had done a lot of editing on because I was submitting when I was submitting it, I was submitting chapter 1 for a lot of things. So I got a lot more work done on chapter 1 as far as rewrites and edits. So that's cool. It took us about a half an hour to read a chapter. Actually less, because I talked a lot, blabbered before we started. So now we're going to jump into chapter 2. What I do want to check real quick. I've got some messages from people on the Twitters. Looks like just some people liking my post. Hopefully you guys are enjoying this. We're going to continue chapter 2 here in a minute. And if you do like it, let me know. If you absolutely hate it, let me know. Because I plan on doing this bi-weekly. I think that I can't do it every Thursday night. I have shooting league every other Thursday. So the off Thursday, when I'm not shooting, we will be doing this. So, chapter 2. If you knew your history when the formation of the federal police force... If you knew your history, then the formation of the federal police force scared you to death. I know it did me. The president had promised to give us a kind of national security force, stronger than the army, but we all thought it would be to combat terrorism. Some warned that this force could be used against the citizens, but most did not listen. Conspiracy theorists became a phrase often used against people who usually weren't considered such. I think the first indication that federal officers were not just in place to stop terrorists is when they confiscated every firearm in the country. The feds claimed dissenters were domestic terrorists if they owned firearms and used that excuse to take their guns. Then they went a step further and took the rest, claiming that without terrorists next door, no one else needed guns either. A lot of people died in that first day. Excerpt from the Journal of John Everman. John and the kids arrived home after the long walk and crossed the sparse front yard to the door. John's neighbor Steve was sitting on his own porch watching the flashing lights down the street. He glanced at John briefly and nodded. John gave a smile and a thumbs up and then ushered the kids into the house. He knew Steve would understand the signal and be on the phone soon to arrange a meeting that night at John's house. John and Steve had grown up together and had been friends as long as they could remember. Steve's mixed heritage had made him the target of bullies, and John was always there to back him up. Steve had introduced John to the woman John would marry, Steve's cousin on his mother's side, which tied the friends together as family. "Hey, Amanda, we're home," John called as he pulled his jacket off and hung it on the hook next to the door. He took the kids' jackets and hung them up as well. His house keys clanked when he dropped them into the ceramic dish on the little hall table. "Back here," John's wife Amanda called from the back of the small house. The kids ran back, giving the requisite hugs and kisses, before sitting down at the kitchen table to do their homework. John entered the kitchen and smiled at the scene that greeted him. The kids were opening books and shuffling papers. Thomas had hesitated when he saw the old milk crate in place of his chair, and had turned an almost offended look on his father. John just gave him a stern nod that indicated any argument would be pointless, and Thomas sat down. Amanda was at the counter finishing up dinner. She was dressed simply in jeans and a t-shirt, and her long dark hair was damp from steam. Dinner smelled great as usual. Amanda had a knack for turning their rations into something enjoyable. He stepped into the room and watched her from the doorway. "Smells great, hon," John said. "Thanks. What's going on up the street?" The flashing red and blue lights were reflected faintly inside the home. Someone turned the Lees in for getting extra rations. They were taking Mr. Lee in, John explained. His voice carried the outrage he felt inside. Amanda knew her husband well enough to know what he was feeling. She wiped her hands on a towel that was lying on the counter and went to him, wrapping her arms around his neck, and gave him We're going to fix that. So she wiped her hands on a towel that was lying on the counter and went to him. Wrapping her arms around his neck, she gave him a quick kiss. The gesture broke his dark mood instantly. "You know there's nothing you could have done but get yourself arrested too," Amanda said quietly. I know, I just hate the feeling. I hate feeling powerless to help. You are far from powerless, John. We just have to remember we can't help everyone. John nodded and let her go, knowing she was right. It wouldn't help anyone if he were arrested, especially the Lees. How was work? Amanda asked after John released her. Oh, fine. Jerry didn't show up again today, so I'll be going in early tomorrow to catch up, John said, washing his hands before helping with dinner. Of course you are, dear, Amanda said. She was moving a pan off the hot burner and set it down a little harder than intended. If I don't, people will notice. They're used to seeing me cover, John said. I know, I'm just tired of barely getting by and you working extra for nothing, Amanda said in a strained voice. Sorry, dear. John broke the uncomfortable silence that followed Amanda's outburst and put his arms around her again. It's not your fault, Amanda said quietly. John looked at the kids who were staring and nodded toward their books. They both whipped around and got back to work. You don't think Jerry's been caught, do you? Amanda went on after taking a moment to relax in her husband's embrace. Did she embrace? Oh, yeah. Okay. I want to make sure that scene didn't seem right. Ooh. Text from my wife. Oh, she's blowing me kisses. Isn't she sweet? I don't know, Amanda. Let's just hope he made it west like he planned, John said firmly. His wife nodded and turned back to put dinner on the table while he helped. The kids moved their books aside while John set down steaming plates of meat and potatoes with a slice of bread on the side. John sat down in his chair and Amanda handed over a napkin. He sat staring at the food momentarily, the hard-earned fruits of his labors, no more and no less than was determined to be his family's need. Eat before it gets cold, Amanda chided. John smiled and started to eat. As usual, Amanda turned otherwise ordinary rations into something good. The meal went on with the clinking of silverware and plates. What about your day, dear? John asked. The kids were good as usual, Amanda said. She worked at a daycare facility for children who were too young for school. Good, John said. Rations were delayed again. No early pickup this week either, Amanda said after a few minutes of silent eating. We'll get by. There was more confidence in John's voice than he felt. They finished dinner, cleared the table, and the kids helped Amanda with the dishes. John settled in his chair in the living room and picked up the national newspaper, hoping he would find something new, but knowing he wouldn't. It was always the same with the one newspaper in the country. Articles about how much the government is doing for the people, new community welfare programs for every problem that could be cooked up by some faceless politician. In the past, people might have wondered how the government was going to pay for it all, but once the president signed the executive order that claimed all wealth, the United States government became the richest in the world. John tossed the paper on the coffee table in disgust. He looked at the one television they had been allocated, but did not turn it on. It would just be the same. All the programming was government-filtered news or mediocre sitcoms that extolled the virtues of their society. The network didn't even televise news about the war with the Republic of Texas because America wasn't winning. John thought back to the day that shocked everyone. An executive order was signed that abolished the states, bringing them all under the umbrella of the American government. 4 states refused and seceded. Arizona, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Texas decided to declare their independence and form the Independent Republic of Texas. They created a very limited central government and kept their state governments pretty much the same. Most of the soldiers that lived and served in those states stayed, and many were more flocked there. Citizens and soldiers alike. Why does this not like that? Remove comma with conjunction. Oh, I see what it's saying. I don't need the comma there. Alright. Most of the soldiers that lived and served in those states stayed, and many more flocked there, citizen and soldier alike. By the time the American government responded, Texas had a large force of armed men and women ready to defend their rights. The war was brief and ended in a stalemate, letting Texas remain sovereign. John gave up and pulled himself out of his chair. A twinge in his back made him wince, and almost regret offering to work extra the next day. He went to the kitchen and put on a pot of coffee, one of the few luxuries available to them, and turned on the back porch light, a light that much of the neighborhood was watching for. Like moths to the flames, several people that lived near would be drawn to this beacon in the dark. Hey, welcome, John. I'm glad you're interested so far. Like I said, this was a sort of an experiment to see how we could do a sort of interactive audiobook and see how it goes. I'm going to edit as I go, but if people see anything like really out of the ordinary or something that doesn't make sense, just shout out and we will address as needed. So we're going to jump right into chapter 3. Another excerpt from the Journal of John Everman. I remember the day they removed the Constitution from its resting place and sealed it away in some secret archive. Our president believed that the document was flawed, outdated, and no longer necessary to protect the rights of citizens. He gave a speech in which he told us how our founders did not allow for the natural evolution of our society and how the document was great for their time, but incompatible with ours. Shortly after the speech, the president signed an executive order banning the owning or display of a copy of the Constitution. I still have mine, safely tucked away until it is needed again. Someday. Excerpt from the Journal of John Everman. So what did happen to Jerry? Steve asked, looking about the room. None of the 55 men and women assembled in the small basement of John's house had an answer. Looking back at Steve were the faces of his friends, light and dark, young and old, small and large, all bonded by the same ideals. Everyone looked worried. As far as anyone knew, Jerry Hernandez had disappeared without telling anyone where he was going. The basement, like most other homes in the Midwest, was more about storm safety than aesthetics. A rough cement floor was bordered by brick walls and a low ceiling of exposed beams capped it. Everyone sat on boxes or stood around the perimeter of the room. It doesn't matter, John said. He's gone. We just have to hope he made it to Texas. Now, I was approved for my travel permit last week, so it's Steve's turn. John looked at Steve, who nodded. I have my paperwork ready to go, and I have an appointment to see the judge tomorrow about it, Steve explained. Good. Once Steve has his permit, we will start leaving in the same order we got our permits in. So, Ed, you will be first. Ed nodded, but kept silent. Remember, we each have different routes for a reason. Don't be tempted to take a shorter one. Any deviation could jeopardize everyone else. Toward the back of the room, Carl stood up, scratching at his stubbled chin. He looked nervous, with all eyes on him. What is it, Carl? John asked. Well, I was thinking, wouldn't it be safer if we just stayed? There was some angry muttering. I mean, we have everything we need. As long as we don't break the law, they leave us alone. Carl, you don't have kids, John started. You don't have to hear what they talk about in school, or try to explain to them why they are being taught that Lenin and Mao are just misunderstood. You don't have to sit by while your kids are being taught that family is unimportant, just a place to raise kids so they can grow up and contribute to the collective. I'm glad, John. Carl looked down and took his seat again. Forget I said anything, John. You're right. John and Steve exchanged a worried look. Are you committed to this, Carl? Steve asked. I am. Carl looked up to meet Steve's eyes. Just scared now that... excuse me. I am. Carl looked up and met Steve's eyes. Just scared now that we're here, I guess. We all are. It's all right to be scared, Steve said. Everyone nodded or murmured their agreement. Does anyone else doubt our plan? John asked. Here in my house, just like in your own, you are free to speak your mind. John looked around, but no one spoke. Some shook their heads and others just watched him. As a group, they had determined to leave their homes and try to make it to a new life in Texas. As a group, they stood with John, willing to do anything to make sure that as many of them made it as possible. John imagined that was the look in the eyes of the founders when they wrote the Declaration of Independence, when those men signed their names to their own death warrant. Everyone in John's basement came from different walks of life, different backgrounds, both economic and ethnic, but they all had one thing in common. All of them wanted a life where their hard work was compensated fairly, where they could do or say what they liked as long as they didn't hurt anyone else. Those that were old enough remembered a time before all the changes, and they were all good people who had volunteered where they could or donated money when they had no time. They all believed in helping others, but none of them believed in being forced. Not one of them wanted to be forced to rely on their fellow man, nor did they want anyone but their families to rely on them. That was why they gathered, and that was why they were all leaving as soon as they could. The meeting soon broke up as some left, but others stayed to talk. Small groups formed to discuss everything from politics to the war, their kids' school or work. John looked on in silence, not really in the mood to participate in any kind of discussion or debate. His wish wasn't respected for long, though, as Steve came up to him. "Can we trust Carl?" Steve asked. John looked down and thought and rubbed the stubble on his chin. He sighed and looked over at Steve. "I think so. He's just scared, like most of us are. I don't think he would do anything stupid." Oh, dude, thank you, John. I appreciate that. This is, like I said, I've never actually... The only person that's a few people have read this outside of my family. It's actually available online, and I'm going to put a link up in Twitter when I'm done with this. I've never read this out loud to anyone, so it's a little, I don't know. Feeling really vulnerable, man. This is my work. Anyway, let's see, where was I? There we go. Steve didn't seem so sure, but he accepted John's answer. Truth be told, John was not so sure either, but if Carl were thinking about doing something like running to the feds, there wasn't much anyone could do about it. We're going to take out that. John avoided conversation the rest of the night, and before long he was saying goodbye to the last of his neighbors. John helped Amanda clean up after the meeting and make sure there was no evidence of the large gathering of people. They didn't talk much. John was more worried as the time for them to leave approached, and Amanda left him to his thoughts. They both headed to bed when everything was put back in order. John lay awake for what seemed like hours after the meeting was over. He couldn't seem to banish the thoughts of their missing member from his mind. Jerry could just as likely be in the hands of the authorities as in Texas. If they had Jerry, then his family was in danger. Carl was a question as well. If he just got scared and backed out, then they had nothing to worry about, but what if he betrayed them? The government paid extra rations and even some luxuries to informants, but Carl hated this government as much as any of them. John just could not believe that any of their group would do that. John was staring at the ceiling, trying to calm his thoughts, when he saw the faint flash of red and blue lights mar the pristine white of the surface he was focused on. With his heart fluttering, John leaped out of bed and stumbled as the tangled sheets kept hold of his foot. He made it to the window and carefully drew aside the curtains. His worst fears were realized when he looked up the street. At the end of the block, a large black van and several police cars were parked. He could see several officers in riot gear forming up, and one officer starting to point to houses along the street, including John's. John was worried someone had talked, and the federal police were here to arrest him and his friends. "What is it, dear?" Amanda asked sleepily. "Feds." John watched as they knocked on the door of an old woman who was not in his group. He realized they were just doing a standard search, since they weren't going directly to the homes of the other members of his group. He pushed away from the wall and rushed down the stairs. It was just like the feds to do this search in the middle of the night, so no one had time to hide anything. For once, John was thankful for insomnia and his obsessive checking for contraband laying about. But he didn't want to take any chances, and he was going to give the house a quick once-over. "Thanks, John." "John, what's going on?" she asked. "Contraband search. I have to make sure it's all put away," John called back. John reached the front door and checked the lock. He could hear Amanda upstairs, probably looking for anything that might be considered contraband. He quickly searched the living room and kitchen. He then checked the loose panel in the back of the closet. Behind the panel were his books, an old flag, and his copy of the Constitution. It was a copy of the Constitution bound in a little book, along with the Declaration of Independence, and sold in museum gift shops years ago. He also kept their travel permits in the compartment. Once satisfied, he closed it up and made sure it was concealed properly. Susan was standing in the middle of the hall when John went back upstairs to check on everyone. He could see she was terrified, but trying not to cry. Amanda was checking their rooms for anything that would be considered contraband. We're going to change that. I used that word several times. Considered illegal. There we go. "Thomas, do you have anything you aren't supposed to have?" John asked as the boy appeared in his bedroom doorway, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Thomas shook his head, and John reached out for Susan. She reached up to him, and he swept her into his arms, trying to comfort her. Loud pounding on the front door startled them all. "Open up! Federal police officers," a man shouted outside. "Quick, back to bed," John whispered, ushering his family back to their rooms. The pounding on the door grew more insistent, but John took his time. He wanted it to seem as if he had just woken up. John answered the door, and 4 federal officers, dressed in black fatigues, pushed their way past him. One of the officers, holding a clipboard, stopped and turned to John while the others began to search the home. "John Everman?" the officer with the clipboard asked. "Yes," John nodded. Your file shows 1 other adult, your wife, and 2 children reside here. Is there anyone else in the house that is not authorized to live here?" "No, it's just us," John replied. "Are we going to find any unauthorized material on the premises?" "No," John replied. The officer nodded and made a few notes on the clipboard. "Please bring your family down here," the officer ordered. John started to call up, but Amanda and the kids had been listening. They came down quietly and stood next to John. Susan took his hand and stood staring at the officers in fear. They could hear the men ransacking the house in their search. The one in charge looked at each of the Evermans in turn, nodding and making marks on his clipboard. The house was not large, and the Evermans didn't have much, but the officers went through everything. John didn't react when the officer searched the closet or broke another one of the kitchen chairs. After what seemed like an eternity, the other 3 officers reported that the house was clear. The man in charge made another note on his board and then put his pen in his pocket. "Thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Everman." With that, the 4 officers left the house. Amanda put the kids back to bed while John started to put the house back in order. But he didn't make much progress. He was furious, but tried his best to contain it for his family's sake. He felt violated and embarrassed. A man's home was almost sacred at one time. Amanda joined him soon after, and he could see tears in her eyes. He stopped and took her in his arms. They stood like that without speaking for several minutes before finally going to bed. All right, that was chapter 3. And we've been able to get to, we're going to do probably about 4 chapters an hour. So it won't take too many episodes to get through the book. Chapter 4. When the government took over the grocery stores, you would have thought they were offering free champagne and caviar to everyone. People actually held massive block parties and city-wide barbecues to celebrate. They were happy that food was going to be free. If they had only spoke the words that I repeat like a mantra, nothing ever offered by the government for free is ever worth a damn. I have to give people credit, though. They didn't complain when they did get the new national grocery and received their ration. Not at first, anyway. People just figured it would take time for the good stuff to be sorted out. It's when the luxury items were destroyed that the people started to realize how it was actually going to be. We get rice, bread, beans, milk, and eggs every week. Meat comes once a month, usually chicken, and fruit every 2 weeks. We have to think about our health, after all. Excerpt from the Journal of John Everman. The morning after the intrusion, John helped get the kids ready for school while Amanda cleaned up the house as best she could. No one talked much as they went about their morning routine, which was regularly interrupted by picking up broken furniture and scattered household items. The officers had broken a vase and a picture frame, 2 of the few special items they managed to requisition. Amanda was trying not to cry in front of the children. John felt like a low burning fire was growing in him, and this was steadily adding fuel. Once the kids were off to school, John helped clean up as much as he could. He picked up the picture frame and held it, looking at the image of his family inside. The broken glass had scratched the picture, but it hadn't ruined it. He opened the back of the frame and took the picture out, shaking the glass off into the trash. The scratch was minor, leaving the images of his family unscathed, damaged but not broken. He folded the picture and stuck it in his pocket and tossed the picture frame and glass into the trash as well. He already dumped the trash, so picture frame into the trash as well. There was still more cleaning to do, and John considered calling in sick so he could help Amanda. He had as many sick days as he wanted, but he just couldn't bring himself to do it. John felt like he received enough free stuff from the government and didn't want to take a free day off unless absolutely necessary. Besides, he'd made a promise to make up for the lost time. Have a good day, Amanda said quietly when John was pulling on his jacket. The numbers on the back somehow felt heavier. I wish I could do more, John gestured to indicate the mess of the house. It's fine. I'll be able to manage the rest. Amanda kept her head down, always busy with something so that she didn't have to look up. John went to her and took her by the shoulders, turning her to look at him. She looked. We're going to fix that. She looked up and gave a shuddering breath. John pulled her into his arms, and she let herself cry for a minute in the protection of his embrace. They didn't speak. He just held her and stroked her hair as she let the stress and fear pour out onto his shoulder. After a few minutes, she stopped, and he held her by the shoulders again. She nodded that she was all right. Love you. Love you too. John kissed her and rubbed the tears from her eyes before she gave him a gentle push toward the door. John started his walk to work with time to spare. He hated being late, but hated breaking his word more. More than that, being late could mean a cut in his rations. It was Friday. John hated Fridays. Before Friday was payday, the start to the weekend and all that. I'm going to fix that there. We don't need that comma. Now it was just a reminder of what they had lost. No paychecks and no weekends. Everyone worked on Saturday. John took a different route to work in the mornings than he did on the way home. He barely noticed where he went, however. His mind was still focused on those men violating his home. It was no longer illegal to search homes without cause or consent. The houses were government property, after all. He just couldn't shake the feeling that his rights had been violated, whether he had rights or not. The people were told they still had rights, but the needs of the community were more important. And fix this. Alright. John's walk took him through a part of town that once was home to quite a few small businesses. Bookstores, gift shops, and novelty stores, among others, were all closed across the country. Their owners were told that their businesses were property of the government. That same government declared all such businesses unnecessary and closed them down. They sent the former owners to work in more productive areas such as manufacturing. That part of town always looked sad to John, but it served as a reminder of what he was risking himself and his family for. Every time he walked through the area, it refueled his desire to flee the only home he had ever known for something better. He reached the mill without seeing another soul and entered the building with the resigned calm of a soldier going to war. After clocking in for his shift, John made his way over to the door leading to the mill floor. The scene through the little protective glass window in the door showed him the same thing it always did. The floor reminded him of those old movies where robots worked at the same menial task over and over. The only difference was the robots he saw were people. Everyone had their station and task, and no one deviated. It was all so regimented that the workers seemed to be one with their machine, and the machine part of the mill, like a living thing made up of gears and flesh, muscle and grease. When he exited the break room into the mill, the noise and heat washed over him like a wave. He instantly started to sweat as he put in his earplugs. He was always struck by the lack of enthusiasm in his coworkers whenever he moved through the mill. As usual, some greeted him, and he smiled and shouted greetings back. Even those smiles were fleeting as everyone returned to their task, head down and eyes dull. The visit by the federal officers the night before was playing over and over in his head. He couldn't figure out why that search, that invasion of his home, felt different than all the other times their house had been searched. Despite his frayed emotions, he kept his head down, took his federally mandated breaks and lunches, and he did his job to the best of his ability. Oh, thank you, John. John finished out his day as usual, clocked out, and started the long walk home. Nothing unusual had happened that day, just like every other day. He walked by the confiscated businesses, the abandoned bar, and the classic American houses. He greeted his kids, but they were unusually quiet on the way home. Something had changed in the world his family knew, and even the children felt it. When he got home, Steve was waiting anxiously on his own front porch. "Go inside and start your homework. Tell your mother I will be in a minute," John told his kids. Once the children were inside, John walked over to Steve's yard. "What's wrong?" John asked. Jeff and his wife are gone, Steve replied. What do you mean gone? John asked, alarmed. Jeff was one of the members of his secret group. Gone. Jeff didn't show up for work this morning, and no one is answering the door at his house, Steve answered. Dear God. Do you think the feds know about the meetings? John's question was not directed at Steve, and Steve did not answer, leaving John with his thoughts for a moment. Maybe they couldn't wait and left on their own, John said, though he did not really believe that. I'm going to change that. That feels clumsy. Though he didn't really believe that. That's my hope. But, John, we have to assume the worst, or we put everyone else at risk, Steve said. John nodded grimly. You're right. We could get everyone together tonight at my place so we can decide what to do, John decided. We may have to go early. 2 nights in a row? Do you really think that's wise? Steve asked. It's a risk we'll have to take. If the feds know about us, then we might not have much time, John said. Besides, if they are onto us, maybe they won't expect a meeting so soon. Steve nodded. I'll make the calls. And the friends shook hands and parted without another word. John stood on his porch watching the people in his neighborhood. His thoughts were on Jeff, his wife, and others that had disappeared in the past. Re-education facilities had been in place for years and were a real fear for citizens who did not acclimate well. It was rumored that anyone sent to them was tortured or even killed. John prayed that none of his friends were facing that sort of horror. After a few minutes of watching the children play across the street, he went inside. The mood in the Everman house was more subdued while the family ate dinner. John had told Amanda about Jeff's disappearance. They did not want to scare the children, so they would discuss it more after they went to bed. Thomas and Susan ate quietly and went about their evening chores without complaint. They seemed to understand the gravity of the situation without being told. We are hosting another meeting tonight, John told his wife while they washed dishes. Amanda did not question him about it. She trusted him enough that if he thought it would be safe, then she didn't need to worry. There should still be enough coffee, was all she said. He gave her a quick kiss and put on a pot. Once the machine was going, he turned the back porch light on and went down to prepare the basement. All right. So that was a chapter 4. Forgot how depressing this was. I haven't actually worked on this in quite a while. This first part is super depressing. Okay. Chapter 5. Government supporters will tell you that the feds had to take over everything. Capitalism had failed, they will tell you. I argue that capitalism wasn't even given a chance. Between regulation and restrictions, business involvement in politics and vice versa, and government's inability to allow the free market to correct itself, real capitalism never even existed. Not that anyone in their right mind wanted an economy without regulation, but the system's perceived failure was firmly in the hands of the government-corporate partnership that passed regulation to benefit some and punish others. Bottom line is America hadn't had a true free market for a very long time, if ever, and that allowed greed and government mismanagement to create the environment that led to the Great Recession. Was it intentional as some speculate? We need a comma there. I don't know. But it doesn't really matter now, does it? Excerpt from the Journal of John Everman. John looked at his friends and neighbors that were gathered in his basement. They all looked worried, some even scared after hearing that Jeff was missing. I don't think we can wait any longer, John began. I bet my dog needs to go out. All right, give me... Do you need to go outside, buddy? No, maybe not. Maybe he's just being a jerk. I don't think we can wait any longer, John began. If the feds arrested Jeff and his family and his wife, it may mean that the rest of us are in danger as well. It's only a matter of time as I see it. I guess he does. All right, give me 2 minutes. I'm going to let the dog out. Come on, buddy. Actually, I'm just going to let him stay out there. Weather's nice. He'll be out there a few minutes. All right, so it's only a matter of time as I see it. All right, what if that's what the feds want? Carl asked. He seemed to be on the verge of panic. Maybe Jeff didn't talk, and they're hoping we will show ourselves. John sighed. Carl, if you are too scared to leave, you don't have to. No one here is obligated to go along with us. John looked at them all as he said the last. Sit down and shut up, Carl, someone in the back shouted. The tension was broken by laughter around the room. Carl laughed nervously after a moment. On a serious note, Steve, who was standing next to John, started. We need to make a decision tonight. 2 of our members are now missing. Jerry could have left without telling anyone, but hold on. I screwed up here, but Jeff? Yeah, we need to fix that. Jerry could have left without telling anyone, but Jeff? My vote is to leave starting tomorrow. We leave individually or in small groups and meet at Benny's cabin, just like we planned. We should have the supplies ready, but he should have the supplies ready by now. I agree, John nodded. Everyone else nodded or said yes. Even Carl, after a nudge from his neighbor, agreed. They all looked at John, waiting for him to tell them what was next. It made him uncomfortable, but they had come to depend on him. All right, remember to pack only what you need. It's a long walk, John advised. Everyone review your routes tonight. Make sure all of your families know the way in case you get separated, Steve added. It shouldn't take anyone more than a day to get to Benny's. We leave from the cabin the morning after next. Don't be late, John added. We can't afford to wait. Everyone knows the route. If you get delayed, you will have to catch up. The meeting broke up as it began. People left individually at intermittent times to avoid detection. Those waiting to leave stood around and talked as usual, but the topics of discussion had changed. Before, they would complain about how bad things had gotten. Tonight, however, they were talking about the future. They planned what they would do once they were settled in the Republic of Texas. It made John smile to finally see hope in the eyes of his friends and neighbors. At least they had something to look forward to, a better place ahead of them instead of behind. It was once said that America was the last bastion of freedom. John realized that night that man will always create a place where freedom holds sway. Steve was the last to leave the meeting. He and John planned on getting their families out after work the next day. They planned to use Steve's work van to get to Benny's on time. John and Benny had already talked before about the possibility that he may have company early if things fell apart, and their group knew to approach the cabin with caution. Benny was a friend of John's father, and John had met the man when they were both younger. As America changed, so did Benny, becoming more reclusive and paranoid. The man lived almost completely without outside contact, but when he did need something, he contacted one of his few friends he could still trust. One of them happened to be John. When he and Steve had started planning their move, they contacted Benny right away to see if he would help. Would, not could. You ready for this, John? Steve asked before he exited the back door. Have to be, John replied shortly. Cheer up, man, Steve cuffed him on the shoulder. Everything will be better when we reach the Republic. With that, Steve walked out of John's house, bound for his own. John stood in his kitchen a moment, looking at the things that had made up his world for so many years. He wondered what it was about human nature that made him regret the loss of things, even things that were not really his. He shook his head. That was a question for people who had more time, he thinks. Wait, what? That doesn't make any sense. That was a question for people who have more time. We're just going to take that out. His family, who were packing upstairs, were more important than any of that. John went to the hall closet and opened the compartment in the back wall. He took out 3 things that he was determined to take with him. Took out the copy of the Constitution, an old American flag, and his Bible. All contraband, but to John they all meant freedom. He carried the burden upstairs to pack with the rest of his things. It was not a burden of weight, but of responsibility. It was a burden he stoically took on. Not that he asked to be responsible for his friends, or even wanted to be, but he was asked to carry it, so he did. With every loss of a friend, or change in their plan, it just got heavier. It was his duty, one he could not shirk, no matter how heavy it got. When he reached the top of the stairs, the activity had died down. The kids were already packed and in bed, their backpacks, shoes, and jackets by the door of their rooms. It would be hardest for them, he knew. He looked at their innocent faces and felt a pang of sadness and guilt. They didn't understand what was happening or why they were leaving. All they knew of the world was the one John was trying to rip them out of. They didn't know anything about this new place, only that what their parents told them. They trusted him because he was their father, but he knew they were scared. He could hear Amanda in their rooms, stuffing clothes into her own pack. Moving to the doorway, he saw that she was packing some extra things for the children in with hers. He wordlessly took some of the extras and placed them in the bottom of his pack with his treasures. Even the children had to carry their own packs, but their parents would make it a little easier for them. "I'm not sure I'm ready for this," Amanda said without looking up. "We'll be fine. I won't let anything happen to us." John put his arms around her protectively. John felt her nod against his chest. He gripped her tighter and kissed the top of her head. "How are the kids with all of this?" John asked her. She leaned back and wiped her eyes before answering. "Better than I expected. I think they were excited and scared. Like they're going on an adventure," she replied. "Let's hope they keep that feeling," John said, looking out the window. "Kids are resilient," she said. She took his chin in her hand and turned his head to look into her eyes. Besides, they believe in their father. He smiled down at her, but he felt the weight of the responsibility settle more firmly on his shoulders. He pushed away his fears to keep them from showing on his face. He gave her a quick kiss, and they both went back to packing. As they were finishing up their own packing, they had heard a loud knocking on the front door. At first John thought it might be one of his neighbors with a last-minute question. That hope was dashed when a loud voice identified the visitor as federal officers. "Dog needs in. Give me 1 minute. Be right back." "Get the kids ready and down to the kitchen," John hissed, grabbing his own pack and rushing down the stairs. When he reached the entry, he quietly checked the lock and chain on the door. The officer knocked again, and John could hear others talking about bashing the door in. He picked up a chair and braced it under the door handle as silently as he could. John looked up as Amanda and the kids descended the stairs and rushed into the kitchen. The knocking became more insistent as he followed them toward the back door. They all pulled up short when they saw a shadow pass across the curtained window of the back door. Amanda hugged her children close as John approached it. He stood a moment, trying to think of something. He knew from the muffled voices there were several officers at the front door, so he decided to take the risk that they had only sent one or two to the back. He reached out and unlocked the door without disturbing the handle. As John had hoped, the officer outside tried the door and found it unlocked. As the door started to open, John grabbed the handle and pulled as hard as he could. The unexpected movement caused the officer to stumble inside, hit the kitchen table, and fall to the floor. The officer's drawn pistol clattered to the tile and slid toward John's feet. The sound of the officer's fall was punctuated by a crash as the front door was torn from its hinges by a battering ram. John only thought about his actions for a heartbeat. He picked up the dropped weapon and pushed his family past the stunned officer and out into the night. All right. Chapter 6. I'm not having to do a lot of changes, which is kind of cool. Well, we'll see how this goes. All right, Chapter 6. The first year of the president's term saw sweeping changes to our society and daily life. Opposition was stiff at first, but the progressives of both houses started to show their faces. All in the name of the greater good, we were given massive bailouts for failing companies, free health insurance, and climate change laws. We were told that we could not afford to sit idle anymore. If companies failed, the country would fail. If companies failed, the country would fail. If people did not get free insurance, it would bankrupt America. If we did not clamp down on carbon, we would destroy the planet. The irony was all of those programs assured the destruction they were supposed to avert. The country's debt skyrocketed, as did taxes and utilities for families. The country went bankrupt, and its citizens right along with it. We had everything on the free government insurance with all its cutbacks and rationing. It was the last, though, the climate change policy, that was the kicker. Those in power had set up companies years before to handle the new product that the climate change laws would create. Imagine our surprise when everyone in the country found out that those carbon credits and green products were being sold by the very same people that put the law into place. All right. And we're going to shift perspective slightly here. Lieutenant Ben Casey hated his job. It was the middle of the night in some Illinois backwater, and he was breaking down doors because his bosses in Washington were paranoid. They were afraid that there was some revolutionary faction bent on rising up against the government. Casey had already arrested 3 of the supposed revolutionaries, and as far as he could tell, they just wanted to leave the country, not fight it. He tried to tell his bosses that, but they didn't want to hear it. The prisoners had been shipped off to Washington for further questioning. As far as Casey was concerned, the government should let them go. If they didn't like the way things were, let them leave. It would make his life easier and let him concentrate on real threats. Casey had been assigned to the federal police right out of college. He had tested well for the kind of work they needed him to do. He was assigned to their counterterrorism task force in D.C. and specialized in sniffing out homegrown terrorists, citizens that felt the best way to create change was to attack the government. That needs to be semicolon, I think. He was good at recognizing those types of people. He was also good at recognizing those that were not bent on violence. This group in Stewart fit the latter description, but he was worried that if they were handled poorly, it would come to that. It could come to violence. No, I don't want to reuse the word violence. Handled poorly, it could turn violent. It was his job, though. It was not like he could quit. He would do his best, follow orders, and keep his mouth shut. Let the higher-ups worry about the morality. His contraband search the night before had cemented his suspicions about the group in Stewart. He knew these people were purists, throwbacks to an America that just did not exist anymore, but they weren't terrorists. He had figured out their routine for meeting and decided his next arrest would be the latest host. He was hoping that John Everman could be persuaded to give up more information than had the last detainees. All these thoughts were at the front of his mind while he looked around the deserted house where the Evermans lived. The front door was destroyed by their ram, and the fragments of a kitchen chair mixed with wood from the door to litter the... Hold on. I think the mixer stream just paused. Hold on. Oh, stupid laptop. There we go. It did. That's why it shut down. Mixer is really... I want to get off of YouTube eventually, but Mixer has been moderately unreliable recently. So we'll see. All right, everything else looks good. All right. So that last sentence was awful. All of these thoughts were at the front of his mind while he looked around the deserted house where the Evermans lived. The front door was destroyed by their ram, and the fragments of a kitchen chair mixed with wood from the door to litter the entryway. Oh, okay, because the kitchen chair was under the... Okay. Keys rested in a ceramic dish on the hall table, and pictures hung on the wall. Hung askew on the wall. Everything that had been disturbed the night before had been put back in place. The Evermans themselves were gone. "Lieutenant, take a look at this," one of the officers called from the hallway. The man was standing outside a small closet, pointing at something inside. Casey looked in and saw a panel that had been removed from the back wall. "So that's where they hid it all," Casey said to himself. "Sir," the officer said, "when we were here before, it was too clean. Everyone has contraband of some sort, some heirloom left over from before. People this clean are usually hiding something. You can be sure of it," Casey instructed. "Yes, sir," the officer said. Casey shook his head in disgust. His expertise was wasted on these grunts. All they understood was doing just enough to get their contract time in and collect their requisitions at the week's end. They were all chosen for their strength, loyalty, and single-minded devotion to doing exactly what they were told. "Have that back wall pulled down," Casey pointed to the closet. "I doubt you will find anything, but search it thoroughly." Casey looked around the house with little interest. His officers were tearing the place apart, but there was nothing to be found. He had dispatched 2 vans to search for the Everman family, but if he had read John correctly, the man was smart. They would not be easy to find. He would call off the search of the house soon, and by dawn they would be knocking on doors, questioning John's neighbors. With a sigh of frustration, Casey went to the house's kitchen to deal with one last problem. Amidst the chaos of the search, one officer sat alone at the kitchen table holding his head in his hands. He did not react as dishes were broken and the contents of cabinets were swept onto the countertops and floors. The officer just sat staring at the tabletop in front of him. "Officer," Casey said sternly as he took a seat across from the man. The officer did react to being addressed by his superior, jumping as if stuck by a pin. He started to stand, scraping the chair's feet on the linoleum. "Sit down," Casey said, gesturing toward the chair. The officer reluctantly took his seat, sitting straight-backed and fixing his eyes on a point just over Casey's right shoulder. A car is coming from the Peoria office to get you. When you get there, write up your report about what happened. Be sure it is accurate," Casey stressed that, "because mine will be. See the quartermaster about issuing you a new weapon and await reassignment. You are no longer on this team." Oh. The officer simply nodded his understanding. "The car should be here soon. You can wait outside." Casey stood up to leave. The officer also stood and saluted Casey before turning to the front door. Casey returned the salute absent-mindedly, already thinking about the road ahead. Chapter 7. Many people were hopeful in the early days of the last president's term. He promised so many reforms and changes in the way our government did business. What people were most happy about was his pledge to bring all of our troops home from all over the world. During the president's second term, major attacks on cities all over the world rushed the decision. There seemed to be a massive awakening of terrorist cells and bombings all over Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. The troops were brought home immediately for our protection. Not everyone thought this was a good idea. It didn't take long for our fears to become reality. Southeast Asia and the Middle East erupted into years of civil conflict once we pulled out. Millions died, but so many in this country did not care anymore. They just said, "It's not any of our concern." All right. After stunning the officer and escaping their house, John and his family had fled through their backyard and the one behind. John scooped Susan up in his arms when she stumbled and nearly fell. When they reached the next street, they heard the federal officers behind them calling out to each other to arrange a search. He quietly urged his family to run faster. John led them down the street and then cut through several more yards, always moving in the same general direction. Steve and John had agreed on a meeting place in case something happened, but they never expected to have to use it. He was headed for an abandoned and overgrown park several blocks from their neighborhood. The trees and shrubs in the park offered concealment from the streets, and the surrounding homes were abandoned. Like many families, they had been relocated by the Fair Workforce Act. I'm glad you like it, John. I really do. Really glad. They continued to run through the yards and empty lots to avoid being in the open. When they had to cross the street, they did it one at a time. Several times they heard shouts or saw the beams of flashlights. The sounds of sirens cutting through the night lent new urgency to their flight. John knew they were getting close to a hiding spot, but he didn't relax just yet for fear he'd made a mistake when they were almost clear. They reached the park without any signs of pursuit. A little over an hour after their escape, Amanda led the kids through the overgrown field toward a stand of trees that John had indicated when they arrived. John stayed behind for a few minutes to scan the area for any signs of pursuit. He was thankful the feds didn't appear to have brought dogs with them and would have to do a search Good Lord, starting to not pay attention to commas. He was thankful the feds didn't appear to have brought dogs with them and would have to search the hard way. He knew it was only a matter of time before they called in canine units, though. Once he was sure that they had not been followed, John made his way back to where the family was hiding. He came upon a scene that he wished never to see. His family was huddled on the ground, scared, tired, and in danger. He sat down next to his wife and put his arm around her shoulders and pulled her close. Susan, who was weeping softly, climbed into his lap, and he held her too. Thomas sat on the other side of Amanda, stoically staring off into the trees and doing his best to maintain his fragile young resolve. John looked at them and wondered if this was how all refugees felt. "We will wait here until morning. If Steve and his family aren't here by then, we'll have to go." "I'm going to make that a contraction," John said softly. Amanda looked up at him. "Do you think the officers tried to take them too?" "I don't know. I didn't have time to see if the feds were at their house. He'll do his best to get his family out." John squeezed her shoulders and kissed the top of her head. They all adjusted as John pulled off his pack and then his jacket. He settled his back against the trunk of a tree and his wife and daughter resumed their positions, seeking the feeling of safety in his arms that they desperately needed. John covered Susan, who was shivering with cold, or fear, with his jacket. He sat and listened to his family fall asleep around him, hoping for their sake it would be soon. Thomas was the last, finally laying down on his side and resting his head on his mother's leg. John settled himself in for a long night, watching the darkness around him. Chapter 8. The Fair Workforce Act had passed during the president's third term. Of course, the national news proclaimed it the greatest achievement in social justice of our time. That would be laughable if the truth were not more sinister. The new law allowed the government the power to relocate people from one town to another to ensure that government businesses had enough workers. People were forced to abandon their homes and move wherever the government told them to. No compensation for their property. The government assumed ownership of all private property years before. Excuse me. We need to fix that. There was no compensation for their property. Homes. Let's change that to homes. Has more impact. There was no compensation for their homes. The government assumed ownership of all private property years before. Excerpt from the Journal of John Everman. John had no idea when he had dozed off, but he was woken up abruptly by someone shaking him and calling his name softly. His first realization was that his arm was asleep where it was holding Susan, and his legs were cold. His second thought was panic. He sat up in alarm, disturbing the rest of his family, but relaxed when he saw Steve's smiling face. And I need to fix this. Hold on, there should be, yeah, there we go. Actually, let me fix that. First line indent. Thought I'd fixed all those. "Sarah and your boy?" John asked, looking over Steve's shoulder. He sighed in relief when he saw Steve's family crouched in the shadows of the trees a few yards away. They were obscured by the fog that had rolled in during the night. "We all made it." Steve waved his family over to join the others. John's own family sat rubbing the sleep out of their eyes and shivering in the early morning chill. Amanda hugged Sarah when she got close, and the three kids stood looking at their parents. Their looks were afraid and uncertain. "Did they go after anyone else last night?" John asked. "I don't know, John. I don't think so. It looks like they were just after you." Steve paused and looked around again. "Do you think Carl turned on us?" John sat silently for a few moments, thinking about the question. He did not like to think that any of his friends would turn on him, but he was beginning to wonder. They had been so careful to disguise their meetings, using different members' houses in random order. They never discussed the meetings in public, and every member had been watched for months before being admitted into the group. "I don't know, Steve. It doesn't matter now anyway. We have to stick to the plan," John said. Steve nodded, accepting John's answer. John had been adopted as the group's leader, much to John's dismay. He didn't want to be anyone's leader and didn't think he was any more qualified to do it than any of the others. The members just looked to him for decisions, even his best friend Steve. Eventually, John accepted the role that was thrust upon him. "We should still be able to get my work van like we planned," Steve said. "We should make it to Benny's in time." "I'll go with you in case you run into any trouble," John said, standing up and retrieving his jacket. "John?" Amanda asked. All the questions she wanted to ask were reflected in her eyes. "We'll be fine. You and Sarah wait here with the kids. We'll be back for you soon," John assured her. He gave quick hugs to his family while Steve said goodbye to his own. With the goodbyes out of the way and their families safely hidden in the trees of the abandoned park, Steve and John started across town. They cut across several yards until they reached Douglas Street. Douglas would take them close to where Steve worked. They walked at a fast pace, watching for any sign of federal authorities. Many of the homes on the street were abandoned, but not so many that two pedestrians would seem out of place. They didn't speak as they walked, and the silence gave John time to reflect on how much things had changed in Stuart. He had grown up in the small town, like generations of Evermans before him. He'd gone to school, met Amanda, and gotten married where their church used to be. His kids were both born at the hospital down the street from that church. Now they were about to leave Stuart for good, and that, to John, was the worst thing about this whole situation. Things had gotten so bad that people would leave everything they ever knew just to get away. John's thoughts were interrupted when Steve pulled him into the side yard of a nearby house. They hunkered down next to some green plastic garbage cans. Steve signaled for silence and pointed to the street, and John looked in the indicated direction to see what had alarmed Steve, what had alarmed his friend. An unmarked black van rolled slowly by on Douglas. The two friends waited tensely as the van crept along. John and Steve both breathed again when the van passed without stopping. They both stood up and started to head through the yard to an adjacent street. "Wait," John said. "If they've searched Douglas already, they probably won't be back. We have no idea if they've searched the other streets, though." "Right, let's get going." Steve patted John's shoulder as he passed on his way back to Douglas Street. The two men didn't see any more federal officers along the way. They reached the intersection of Douglas and 5th and casually looked up the cross street to the right. Across the street and 2 blocks away was the National Upkeep and Beautification Department's Steward office. It was the government's answer to keeping all of their newly acquired property in some sort of decent shape. Much to the men's dismay, a black van was parked out front. The two ducked into the doorway of an abandoned storefront and watched the van. John knew loitering would eventually get them noticed, but they had little choice and less time. "What do you think?" Steve asked. "We can't wait too long. Where's your van?" "In the garage around back." We're going to shorten that. "In the garage around back, but the keys are inside," Steve replied. "If we do get in there, can we trust your boss to keep quiet?" "He hates the feds as much as we do. He won't tell them anything. But he will have to report the van stolen. He should give us a couple of days before he does, though," Steve explained. "Good. By then we can have it dumped somewhere along a different route," John said. They walked a few more minutes in silence, and their patience paid off. 2 uniformed officers exited the building and climbed into the van. John and Steve ducked further into the shadows of the doorway and watched the van drive up the street away from them. After the vehicle... I don't want to use the same word too often. After the vehicle turned a corner, they walked casually across the street. Steve held the door for John, and they entered the reception area of the building. Steve smiled at the woman sitting behind a metal and wood desk. The interior was cold and colorless, and instantly made John uncomfortable. "Margaret, is Jack in his office?" "Steve," she said quietly, "what are you doing here? There are some men looking for you." "Don't worry about that. I just need a minute with Jack." "Sure, I'll let him know you're here," she said. "Thanks, Margaret." Steve smiled and rapped her desk with his knuckles. He led John down the hall toward the back of the building while the receptionist called back to Jack's office to let him know they were on the way. Reaching a door that bore the simple plaque marked "Manager," Steve knocked and entered without waiting for a response. The office that he led John into was a drab, uninspiring room furnished with a desk, a couple of chairs, and a filing cabinet in the corner. There were no pictures, posters, or decoration of any sort. Behind the desk sat an older man, round in the middle and bald on top. As he entered, he shuffled some papers together on his desk and stood up with a cautious smile. "Steve, what are you doing here?" Jack asked. "I need a favor, boss," Steve started. "We need to borrow the van for a few days." Pardon me. "Steve, there were agents here looking for you. What have you gotten yourself into?" This time he looked at John as if he were the cause of all of Steve's problems. "Don't worry about it, Jack. Listen, just give us the keys to one of the older vans and we'll be out of your hair." I need to put more contractions in this. Jack looked at both of them, weighing the decision before him. John could see that he was torn between doing the right thing and doing the legal thing. Finally, he went to his desk and opened a drawer. Retrieving a set of keys, he tossed them to Steve. Jack's hand shook, but he looked Steve right in the eyes. "Be careful, Steve," he said. "I will report it stolen day after tomorrow." Steve smiled and shook his hand. "Thanks, boss. You have no idea how much this means." "Oh, I think I might," Jack said as they left the office. Steve took the lead again, walking toward the back of the building. John could see some workers typing or filing in the offices as they passed. It was a disciplined environment, sterile almost. No one talked, gossiped, or told jokes. Every office was bare of any personality. It was nothing like the television shows that John could remember watching as a kid, depicting offices like this as a beehive of activity. Those shows seemed almost like fantasy to him, as if what he was seeing now was the only reality there ever was. At the end of the main hall, Steve opened a steel door that led to a large, dimly lit space. The smell of gasoline, oil, and exhaust washed over John as he entered. Workbenches lined one wall with their tools organized on racks above. A few lockers sat against the opposite wall, and one van was parked on the end of the large garage. The box-like vehicle was white, with two small windows in the double side doors behind the passenger door. Large letters on the side identified it as an NUBD van. "Can you get the door?" Steve pointed to a chain hanging on the side of the wide metal door opposite them. John nodded, and Steve climbed into the van and started it up. John slid the spring-loaded latch to the side and felt the door give a little. He grabbed the loop chain and started pulling, bringing the door up toward the ceiling on its rails. Once Steve had backed the van out of the garage, John reversed the chain until the door was down far enough that he could grab it. He ducked under and pulled it the rest of the way down and heard the latch spring into place. Climbed into the passenger side of the van, and Steve turned it onto the street toward the park. "Do you think everyone else was able to get out?" Steve asked after a few minutes. "I don't know. I hope so," John said. John took the pistol out of his waistband of his jeans and made sure the safety was on. He then opened the glove box and buried the weapon under a mass of invoices, bills, and work orders he found in the small compartment. When he sat back, Steve was glancing at him out of the corner of his eye. "You've had that this whole time?" Steve asked. "One of the feds dropped it at my house. Not sure why I picked it up. It just seemed like the right thing to do at the time," John said. "Let's just hope we don't have to use it," Steve said. John nodded, hoping the same thing. They drove the rest of the way in silence, on the lookout for federal agents. When they reached the park, Steve pulled into an overgrown parking lot at the back side. John looked at the cracked and peeling NUBD logo on the side after he closed his door. He picked up a piece of the decal, which peeled up a little more. "You go get the others. I'm going to see if I can take care of this logo," John said. Steve nodded and walked toward the wooded area of the park. John picked at the decals on the van. They were so damaged from the elements that his only challenge was peeling off a piece larger than a couple inches square. By the time Steve returned with their families, though, he was nearly finished. Steve helped him with the last decal while their wives settled the children into the back. There were no seats in the back, so they did their best to make it comfortable. Once they were all settled in, and Steve was back in the van onto the road again, John looked back at their families. They all looked a little scared. That was what angered John the most. Fear in the eyes of his wife and child. Fear caused by those who were supposed to protect him and his family. He smiled reassuringly before turning back to face the road ahead. Soon, he hoped, they would be in a much better place. "Sir," an officer stepped through the open door into Lieutenant Casey's... we're changing scenes again, so... "Sir," an officer stepped through the open door into Lieutenant Casey's temporary office in downtown Stewart. The officer saluted and waited to be addressed. "What is it?" Casey asked without looking up from his report. "Everman's neighbor didn't show up for work today, and his house is empty. There have been other reports of workers not showing up at their jobs. We're currently investigating them as well," the officer said, still standing at attention halfway between Casey's desk and the door. Casey looked up at the officer, studying the man and using the time to think. "They must have used the raid last night as a distraction," Casey said quietly. "Sir?" The officer had not heard him. "Sergeant, our targets are already on the move," Casey said louder. "Continue to investigate the houses of those that didn't show up to work. I want a list of the names of those whose houses are empty. Send Foster on your way out. Send Foster in on your way out." "Yes, sir." The sergeant saluted again and left the office. "Sir, you wanted to see me?" Another federal officer walked into the office and saluted. "Foster, get on the phone with the Peoria office and tell them we're going to need officers down here. Tell them we need more officers down here. Our subjects are on the move, and we're going to have to cast the net wider," Casey said. "Yes, sir." Foster saluted and left the office. Casey pulled out a map of the area around Stewart, quickly outlining the best routes for a group of people to travel north or south. He figured they would head south to the Republic of Texas, but he would leave no possibility unexplored. Okay. We are going to do Chapter 9, but I do need to use the restroom. Give me 1 minute, and we will do Chapter 9. Oh, I need to get some WD-40 on that hinge on that door. Okay. Do one more chapter. Hold on. Welcome back. Oh, it's still alive. Okay, we're doing good. All right, we're still here. We're still live. John, you still here? I can't tell. It says only one person's watching. Anyway, Chapter 9. I imagine that the ancients who predicted the end of the world had a much different definition than the one we latch on to today. I think when we left Stewart, that was the end of our world, so to speak, the world we knew. It didn't mean we were going to die or that everything was going to blow up. It just meant that the world as we had known it was going to change forever. Many felt that the end of the world was going to happen in 2012 or the year before, or any number of other times. In a way it did, just not in the way or time that all of the television programs and books said it would. There was even some ridiculous movie about it. It was when our president was re-elected a third time. It was when our president was re-elected a third time. That day, some of us knew it. The world would never be the same. That major change in our system and apparent acceptance by the public's voting for him gave him the confidence to push more drastic changes. Too bad no one predicted that would be the beginning of the end. We might have been able to avert it if we had known. I'm going to make that its own sentence. We might have been able to avert it if we had known. Excerpt from the Journal of John Everman. All right. I hope Benny is ready for us so early, Steve said. The white van was parked at the beginning of a long gravel drive that led off the highway and back into some woods. They could see part of the drive before it turned and started up one of the large hills that framed the highway. The trees bordering the highway were showing signs of fall in the brilliant reds and gold mixed with the evergreens. The two families had been on the road for a little over an hour, using back roads and virtually abandoned state highways to reduce their chances of being spotted by the authorities. Only one way to find out. Let's go up and see who has made it so far. Just remember, drive slow so we can see who it is before we get to the house, John said. Steve did just that, driving up the steep hill slowly. The man who lived at the top was sure to be watching and did not trust anyone. Only a few yards back from the road, the gravel drive disappeared to become so overgrown it was impassable. Apparently, doesn't like that comma. Here we're finding some of my typos. Only a few yards back from the road, the gravel drive disappeared to become so overgrown that it was impassable. It would seem to anyone that did not know better that the path had been unused for years, ever since meeting Benny through someone in Stewart. No, John has known Benny. Hold on. I thought John had known Benny for a while. We're just going to say even John had only been up to the cabin twice. The van reached the top of the hill and crossed a field toward a small log building set just in the tree line. It was the type of place that used to be featured in survivalist and hunting magazines. Self-sufficient, no electricity, wood stove for cooking and heating. It was the perfect image of independence. They could see a man sitting on the porch with a rifle across his lap. Benny and a few others managed to stay off the grid. When the gun bans were passed by the government, these men and women held on to their weapons as they had vowed to do all their lives. Since they had no real contact with the rest of the world, the government had a hard time finding the survivalists to relieve them of their weapons. Steve pulled the van close to the cabin, and John rolled down the window. "Benny, it's me, John." "You're early, John," Benny said. Benny was one of those guys who would inevitably bear the name Grizzly Adams. He was large, hairy, and intimidating to those who had never met him. He wore a thick beard that was streaked with gray, but his dark hair was yet untouched with age. He was dressed in hunter's camouflage and heavy brown boots. Benny leaned his rifle against the wall and stood up. "Sorry about the change in plans. There was an emergency and we had to leave early. We were hoping you might have gotten the supplies ready by now," John explained. Benny looked past the van toward the road. "You weren't followed, were you?" "No one followed us. We got out of town without anyone seeing us. This place isn't safe anymore, though. A couple of our members have gone missing," John said. Benny nodded, accepting John's explanation. "We don't have much time, then." The bearded man waved toward the side of the cabin. "Your people are hiding in the back. I'll get the rest of the supplies and meet you back there." Stepping into the backyard, they were greeted by the families that lived around them. Hands were clasped and hugs exchanged. John did a quick head count. 54. Actually... Oh, that wants a hyphen. 54 members of their group and their families. Everyone who was at their last meeting had made it. John was relieved, but he had held out for some small hope that his two missing friends would somehow make it as well. This was the last meeting place that the entire group knew about before crossing into Texas. Once they were gone from Benny's, anyone left behind would have to find their own way. Benny handed John and Steve each a large package, wrapped in brown paper and tied with a string. He also started passing guns around to the men who looked old enough to have handled one before the ban. John took note of the large pack in Benny's hand. "So you changed your mind?" John asked. "Looks like I've got no choice," Benny said, handing John a hunting rifle. "Besides, you city folk will just get lost." John smiled when the grizzled recluse turned away without further comment. He turned back to the rest of the group. "I don't think we should wait for the morning. Last night the feds tried to arrest me and my family, and now they're searching for us. I believe that everyone is coming with us is here, and there is no reason to wait any longer," John explained. Everyone looked worried, but none spoke. John looked at every face, but no one disagreed with his determination. He simply nodded and turned back to his family. John and Steve opened the packages of supplies and divided the contents among their family's packs. It was enough food to last for several days if they were careful. The rest of the group began gathering their own gear. "John," Benny said behind him. John turned to face the bearded woodsman. "Take them south. I will dump the van and catch up with you tomorrow," Benny said. Steve had heard the comment and started to pull the keys from his pocket. "I don't know, Benny. That's more dangerous now. If the feds come this way searching for us, you might get caught." "I know it was the plan before, but things have changed," John replied. Steve dropped the keys back into his pocket. "More dangerous to leave it here. Eventually they'll find your trail, but I can at least send them the wrong way first. It should buy us a few days." John considered the man's plan. Benny had a point, but John hated to risk any of their number. He looked to Steve for some sort of reaction, but his neighbor was looking at him expectantly. Steve was waiting for his reluctant leader to call the shots. In the end, John accepted the logic of Benny's plan. They were risking one man to give a better chance to the rest of them. Finally, John nodded, and Steve handed the keys over. "Stick to the rocky area along the old creek bed. Hard on the feet, but it'll cover your tracks. I'll find you tomorrow," Benny said. John held out his hand, and the recluse took it in his meaty paw. "Good luck." "Same to you, John." All right, I'm going to highlight Chapter 10. Now, if you've... There we go. That way I know where we are. All right, so if you've been watching, thank you so much. If you're watching the recording, be sure to like, comment, subscribe. Drop some comments and let me know what you think about this show. If you're enjoying it, if you want more, if you have any thoughts or ideas, let me know. Check out Twitter and Facebook. I am going to share the links to where you can read this online if you want to read it at your own pace. Bear in mind that what you read online will not include any edits I make during this show. The copy that I'm going to give you is going to be the unedited version I submitted a couple years ago for a contest. So it will not have any of the changes that I make going forward, but it will at least give you something you can read on your own time if you feel like it. I would love to hear your thoughts, what you think of the book, where you think I maybe need to I don't know, step up the action, add more risk, anything that doesn't make a lot of sense. Bear in mind, again, this is a very political book. It is. I'm not going to hide that. I'm not going to try to obscure that behind anything else. It is a political book. It is a political story. But hopefully I have managed to capture a very broad perspective from a lot of different angles, a lot of different political ideologies and thought process. So I'm going to end the show tonight. We will have another show just like this one in 2 weeks, because next week will be shooting night, I believe. If it's not, I will have another show. So join us in a couple weeks for the beginning of Chapter 10 and into the rest of the last Exodus. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. I really appreciate it. And you guys have a great rest of your week. I may see you Saturday morning for Saturday randomness. Otherwise, I will reschedule that to Sunday. You guys have a great one. I'll see you next time. Much love.